This story begins with Lee Strobel, a prominent investigative atheist journalist for Chicago's leading press. After leading a quiet and happy life with his wife, he will have to face the biggest challenge of his life when one night, after obtaining an important award for his work, he goes out to celebrate with Leslie, who is pregnant, and her daughter Allison, but suddenly something unexpected happens. Allison chokes on a piece of food, and no one can make the girl breathe. The anguish grows, while her breathing decreases. However, a nurse miraculously came in and intervened and saved the little girl's life. The next day Leslie, in gratitude for that great gesture of hers, brings some sweets to the nurse, who is a Christian and is fully sure that it was Jesus who took her there, since she was going to another restaurant. Leslie was very excited to hear about Christ, so the next day she went to church, looking for an answer. Listening to her message, she is very moved by the preaching and agrees to believe in Jesus as her Lord and Savior. So Leslie, she starts attending church constantly even though her husband disagrees because she doesn't believe in God. Time passes and not only does Lee spend all his time at work, but Leslie does not stop congregating and dedicating her time to God, and as a couple they hardly see each other anymore. For that reason Lee feels very nostalgic, remembering those times he spent with Leslie. He believes that she has changed because of her love for Christ, and he is very upset by what Leslie is doing. It seems to him that she is blinded. For that reason he decides to investigate the life of Jesus to show that faith in Christ is meaningless, and that he is just wasting her time. He is sure that the resurrection narrative is more legend than history, and that Christianity lacks any solid foundation. His investigation begins in Wisconsin. There he visits a doctor, an expert in the resurrection, who confirms that 500 people are witnesses to the resurrection of Jesus, since there are historical records that validate it, but Lee still doubts and believes that this test is not enough. There the doctor culminates the conversation, asking him why the first martyrs died voluntarily, if they thought that the resurrection was a hoax. On the way back, an emergency call makes Lee go immediately to the hospital, where his wife is with their new baby. She says he was in a lot of pain, but since he couldn't locate him, he called Davis, and thanks to her prayer everything went right. The next day, he does his police investigations on the case of Koblinski, an attacked policeman. For this reason he visits the suspect in jail for questioning, but he insists that he is innocent despite finding evidence against him. Lee, whenever he can, dedicates more time to his personal research on Jesus, so he goes to speak with Father Marquez. Lee does not understand how Marquez left his work as an archaeologist to follow all the rules and commandments that the Bible dictates, just to validate a faith in Christianity, which from Lee's point of view is founded on sand. Lee argues that not everything that is written on the ground is necessarily true. He wants to know how to be sure of the veracity of the manuscripts where he says that there are people who saw Christ after his crucifixion. Marquez answers that in the same way that any historical document is authenticated, verifying, comparing and contrasting the copies that have been recovered. That is called textual criticism. The more copies you have, the more cross-references are made, to know if what the original says is historically accurate. The older they are, the better. For example, the Iliad, the Greeks considered it their Bible for a long time. Today there are 1575 copies of the original and it was written 800 years before Christ, giving 1,100 years between the copy and the original. There is only one ancient manuscript copy that has more authenticated copies than the Iliad, and that is the New Testament. To date, archaeologists have recovered 5,843 Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, something like 4 times more than what we have of the Iliad. The oldest fragment of the Gospel of John was found in ancient Egypt, dating back to the 2nd century AD. Marquez states that they are less than 30 years old, showing him a copy as his most valuable treasure. So there is no book in history that comes close. Marquez ends by saying, "And now, do you think it's reliable enough?" After everything he has heard, Lee should be convinced that the story of Christ is true, but on the contrary, he still has many doubts, so he continues his investigation inquiring about Jesus, while his relationship with Leslie gets worse and worse. Leslie, confused by Lee's attitude, asks Davis for advice, who advises her to talk to him, as she did before, and for her to listen and understand her position. Lee talked to Dr. Phillips to tell him that Jesus' tomb was empty because Jesus simply was never there. So the doctor replies that there are records of people who were witnesses, and precisely that leaves Lee more in doubt because when comparing the stories, he finds inconsistency, so the doctor clarifies that regardless of that, the core is the same. He gave the example of a police officer who investigates several witnesses at the same time. He will never expect secondary details to be consistent, because if they all agree on the same secondary details, he would be taken as a suspect. Leslie follows Davis's advice. In addition to that, she invites him to church. Lee accepted just to see if he gets something that can help the investigation of him. When Lee says goodbye to Davis, he takes the opportunity to tell him to stop manipulating Leslie by bringing her to church, but despite Davis explaining that it is Leslie who is looking for God, he is only interested in keeping her out. And lets him know. At work, Lee, worried and scared, talks to his friend, since he feels that he is going to lose his wife. The only thing his friend advises him is to make sure that she knows that he loves her very much. Lee, following the advice of her friend trying to salvage her relationship with Leslie, asks her to go out alone to dance and she accepts. That night, Leslie tells him that she does not know how to explain what she is experiencing. He feels that he is going on a trip to the most incredible place he has ever been, and without being able to take it with her. Lee tries to make her doubt her faith, but she explains that faith is the certainty of what we cannot see or touch, and we must believe what she feels. She tells him that she loves him more than ever, and since she accepted Jesus into her heart, her love for her husband has grown, it has intensified, and if that is not proof, she does not know. What will it be? He insists that this proves nothing, that they are just feelings, but she asserts that her feelings are a valid experience of what is real to her. In the end, all that conversation was useless, since he threatened her that if it continued like this in a couple of years he would separate from her. Leslie, disconsolate and not knowing what to do, she goes to talk to Davis at the hospital, and telling her about her concern, Davis tells her that everything has her time and in her way God keeps her promises. Just as God promised Ezekiel that he would give him a new spirit and took out his heart of stone to give him one of flesh, and affirms that the same truth will be for Lee. From that day on, Leslie believes that word and prays that God would give her husband a heart of flesh. Unlike Lee, he is just more obsessed with proving Christianity false, even though he still has no proof. He is now going to meet with nothing more and nothing less than Dr. Roberta Wetters, president of the American Association of Agnostic Psychoanalysts. The doctor, before Lee's approach that the followers of Christ can be convinced of their own delusions, says that it is totally impossible since hallucinations like dreams only occur in the mind of the individual. They do not spread like a cold, for which how can you understand that 500 people have the same dream? That is impossible. Following the case of Officer Koblinski, due to a report Lee made, the suspect was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Which causes Lee to feel guilty, so he investigates more of the case, and noticing something strange goes out to inquire about it, so he realizes that his truth was not how he made him believe in the report, it was simply tricked by the same policeman, and since Hick is innocent, he must now recant. The next day, he meets with the doctor, Alexander Metherell, in California, because he wants to refute the most significant event in human history, alleging that perhaps Christ did not die on the cross, perhaps someone lowered him from it or faked his own death. The doctor understands his theory, but as a doctor and scientist he can assure him that this theory is pure rubbish, since Jesus was flogged before his crucifixion, and he explains in detail how Jesus died. From the lashes and blows to his slow and excruciating death by suffocation, and that is something that is impossible to fake. Concluding that the crucifixion of Jesus is one of the most attested events of ancient civilization, it is at this moment that Lee is dismayed, since it was not what he expected to hear. After several days, Lee hears that Hick was attacked in prison and decides to visit him in the hospital, to tell him that it is his fault for not having seen the truth. Hick only makes him remember that it was Lee himself who did not want to see that truth. So Lee is moved. Confused and disoriented, he begins again to go through all the files he has on the investigation of the crucifixion, until remembering what Father Marquez told him about why Jesus died.
Es muy sencillo. Por amor.
He immediately goes looking for Leslie and is honest with her, tells her about the panic he felt when he became a Christian and decided to prove to her that all this was a hoax, but in the end he couldn't because the evidence in favor of his faith was more overwhelming than what he had imagined. So he tells her that he believes in Jesus and she is full of joy. He tells her that to believe and to receive is to convert. So, she teaches him how to talk to God and open her heart to him. 3 months later, he learns that Hick has recovered and left the hospital and moved to another county. Lee asks his boss to write an article in the first person about a man's journey from skepticism to faith. His boss doesn't like it and he flatly tells her to forget it. Arriving home and telling Leslie that the article was not accepted, it occurs to her that she should then write a book, which Lee thinks is wonderful and begins to write the book called The Case for Christ by Lee Patrick Strobel, which became one of the best-selling books internationally, the first in a series that today has more than 14 million copies in print worldwide. Years later, Lee left journalism to be the pastor of the same community church where Leslie took him when he was a skeptic. Since the publication of the book, Lee has written more than 20 books and has traveled the world, sharing his story from atheism to faith. His children living the story of his father followed in his footsteps. Little Allison is now the author of 6 novels that guide people to God. This is the summary of a Christian movie based on real events, called The Case of Christ. Click here and do not miss the following story.